were the only Unitarian Universalist kids in our whole town. We lived in a small town, still very much a farm town back then, up in Oregon, a place where most people called themselves Christian. There were a lot of churches, but not one of them was Unitarian Universalist, not even close. Sometimes, just to be part of the crowd, we'd go with all the other kids to the church that was just outside the trailer park where we lived, just across the ditch and past old Charlie's house. They had a vacation Bible school during the weekdays in the summer, and vacation Bible school had snacks and free loot. We'd memorize and recite Bible verses in exchange for stickers and candy. Verses like Luke 6:31, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Colossians 3:20, "Children, obey your parents in all things." And confusingly, Acts 5:29, "We must obey God rather than humans." Also prescribed for children, Psalm 139:14, "I praise you, God, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." In the Bible, fearful means awe-inspiring and amazing, not scary. But I didn't know how to parse those verses back then, and we weren't expected to. Learning was a matter of remembering the right words. In the church I went to on Sundays, the Unitarian Universalist Church an hour away in the big city, we also learned about the Bible, but we learned stories from other world religions too. And we learned about how science added new layers of meaning or new lenses of interpretation to the old stories. One time we searched for the spark of life by dissecting a frog in Sunday school. We couldn't find it, which was indeed awe-inspiring. I think somebody's mother must have been a biology teacher, because there's definitely no official curriculum for kids that calls for a frog carcass. We practiced reducing, reusing, and recycling to care for the earth and its creatures, and instead of being told what God is like, or even whether to believe in something called God, we sang Spirit of Life. In song, we called to the Spirit of Life to come to us, so we could experience it directly for ourselves, for it to move our hands, giving life the shape of justice, and to help us always be compassionate people. Roots hold me close, wings set me free, we sang. That song was brand new when I was a kid, but it was catching on like crazy in UU churches across the country, and it felt like we'd always been singing it. The words were just right for our theology. Roots hold me close, wings set me free is such a great metaphor for the way we embrace learning in Unitarian Universalism. Learning is fundamental to our tradition. We have historically walked right toward new revelation in learning, even when it threatened to shake our very foundations of our religion. When our Unitarian ancestors encountered biblical criticism for the first time back in the 1800s, and they tried reading the scriptures as though they were literature and not a historical record or the exact words of God, they discovered that the scriptures had much to say about themselves that had been overlooked. They contained assumptions, contradictions, and literary techniques. They did not, our religious ancestors nervously noted, contain the Trinity, nor did Jesus appear to think of himself as God. They could have disregarded this new information, but instead they accepted it and they allowed it to change the church. In 1841, the gun-toting abolitionist minister Theodore Parker preached a sermon in which he encouraged people to be willing to let go of religious teachings when new learning enlarges our understanding and makes them obsolete. He quoted Jesus, who said, "Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away." If the true heart of our ancient tradition is so eternal, Parker said, then why do religious leaders tremble with fear whenever a heretic raises a question, as though the faith were about to crumble? Unitarians and Universalists were still under the Christian umbrella back then. Parker said, "Religious forms may be useful and beautiful. They are so whenever they speak to the soul. In our present state, some forms are perhaps necessary, but they are only the accident of Christianity, not its substance. They are the robe, not the angel, who may take another robe, quite as becoming and useful. It reminds me of a story told by the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. Imagine you're on a journey, he says, and you have to cross a river. It's slow moving, but too deep to walk across, and you need to keep your pack dry. So you stop to build a raft. It takes some time finding the logs, binding them together with rope. Finally, you finish. You get on the raft with your pack and you cross. You arrive at the other side. Do you then think to yourself, I invested a lot of time in this raft. I'm not just going to walk away from it and heave it up on top of your shoulders and carry it across dry land for miles? Or do you realize it has served its purpose and with gratitude leave it for another traveler? Your purpose was to get to the shore. The raft is a tool. The raft is not the shore. Likewise, a teaching is useful only insofar as it helps move us along on our spiritual journey, closer to truth, closer to love, closer to fulfilling our potential as creatures fearfully and wonderfully made. Speaking in the theology and the language of his time, Parker wrote, "The solar system as it exists is in fact permanent, though the notions of Thales and Ptolemy, of Copernicus and Descartes about this system prove transient. So the Christianity of Jesus is permanent, though what passes for Christianity with popes and catechisms, with sects and churches in the 1st century or in the 19th century prove transient also. Some philosophers refused to look at the moon through Galileo's telescope, for according to their theory of vision, such an instrument would not aid the sight. Thus, their preconceived notions stood up between them and nature. Now, it has often happened that men took their theology thus at second hand and distorted the history of the world and human nature besides, to make religion conform to their notions. Their theology stood between them and God." Parker went on to say that there is one true religion in this universe, but many paths to it. One truth, many paths. The real truth is not called Unitarian Universalism or Catholicism or Buddhism or Judaism. Those are paths to it. None are perfect. The point is to worship only what is worthy of worship and not the teachings themselves. Parker called it God, and he envisioned something more eternal than the human-like deity people have fixated on. You must decide for yourself what to call the highest good in this universe, but it won't be called power, money, or ego, and that is the point of all this religion in the first place. In this church, on this path, we trust in your personal journey of learning and discovery, realizing that theology has to be of use in your life, and it has to resonate in your heart, and that you probably won't know what does resonate with you until you've lived into it for a while. You won't really have learned it until your living has tested it. So it's okay to grow and change. In fact, you must. Take the religious value of the inherent worth and dignity of all people, for example. More than once in this election cycle, someone has asked me what it really means. When we are kids, we're taught that it means being inclusive. As we get older, we are taught that it's about being open-minded. But what does it mean to be open-minded and inclusive as adults? Does it mean that anything goes? Do we have to put up with people behaving in ways that are harmful? As we mature, we notice that the concept of inherent worth and dignity is not adequate if we think of it merely as tolerance or if we leave it just on the individual level. It doesn't make sense to say each person has inherent worth and dignity, therefore each person can do whatever they want to others. That leads to harm. Because we honor all people and we see the big picture, we don't tolerate oppression. And since the harm or oppression of one is bad for us all, dismantling oppression is a way of honoring the inherent worth and dignity even of the oppressor. It is a way of loving from a position of strength. When we allow a teaching to evolve, we arrive at a deeper, more mature theology. It's valuable for our learning to be tested in this way. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote, "Let us imagine a pilot and assume that he had passed every examination with distinction, but that he had not as yet been at sea." Kierkegaard's talking about the pilot of a ship here, not a plane. He died in 1855, 14 years after Parker's sermon, and about 50 years before the first plane took flight. Let us imagine a pilot, he says, and assume that he had passed every examination with distinction, but that he had not as yet been at sea. Imagine him in a storm. He knows everything he ought to do, but he has not known before how terror grips the seafarer when the stars are lost in the blackness of night. He has not known the sense of impotence that comes when the pilot sees the wheel in his hand become a plaything for the waves. He has not known how the blood rushes to the head when he tries to make calculations at such a moment. In short, he has had no conception of the change that takes place in the knower when he has to apply his knowledge. The Hebrew scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, tell the story of a man named Job. He was a wise man, someone who counseled others in the village square, who was revered and respected, someone who had learned a great deal and who passed that learning along to others. Noblemen and noblewomen hushed, and they listened when Job was around, the scriptures say. And he counseled widows and the poor as well. He had a wisdom that people from all walks of life found useful. Maybe he could be compared to a Pema Chodron or a Thich Nhat Hanh today, contemporary teachers with popular books about spiritual life. Job was like that in his own tradition. But in the story our ancestors tell us about this wise man, like a ship's captain who finds that the wheel in his hand has become a plaything for the waves, Job finds himself filled with terror and surrounded by darkness. His life falls apart. He loses his savings, his home, his children, his livelihood, all of the things that keep us up at night. He loses not one of them, but all of them. He has never had to apply his learning, his wisdom to his own life at this level. Maybe no one has. The story is very dramatic about the swiftness and the scale of his losses. He grieves deeply, tearing at his hair and his clothes. Still, he is able to acknowledge, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return." Life is change, he knows. He always knew. When he loses his health and he's suffering physically as well as emotionally, he begins to curse the day he was born. His friends suggest that he must have done something wrong, and this way they can imagine that they won't suffer the same fate. But Job knows he's been as good as he can be. If his friends were wise, he said, they would just stop talking already. At least they're sticking around. The rest of the townspeople have distanced themselves from him. And that way, they don't have to confront their own vulnerability, the thinness and fragility of their control over their lives. Job's suffering tests his faith in life itself, that life is even worth living. He almost loses all hope in it. He's utterly vulnerable. "My soul is poured out within me," he says. Why me? Why has this happened to me? What can he do? He can't fall any further. He's so low. The days continue, and he is, if not hopeful, at least still learning. What Job learns when his learning is applied to his own life is what it really means to be small and humbled before his God, which is to say, to acknowledge his true smallness in the universe. He stops asking, "Why did you do this to me?" and begins to ask, "Now what?" This may be the wisest question of all. Now what? A courageous question. It's a question that leads him into a new life. He moves forward, changed. He is a new kind of wise man now. His wisdom is personal. It was not won easily, but it is as deep as life itself. The story says that his life becomes twice as rich as it once was. We who have lived long enough to grieve know that when this happened, his old life was still with him in his heart and always would be. We're learning all our lives. Good religion supports formal education, and it embraces lived experience and heart wisdom as well. It puts it all into conversation with the teachings of our ancestors from around the world, and it's not afraid of evolving in pursuit of truth, depth, love, and justice. This openness has caused some to wonder whether there's any substance to Unitarian Universalism. I understand the confusion. We won't hand you a set of doctrines here and insist that they are all the transportation you need in your life's journey. There are no easy answers in this place, but there is depth, there is wisdom, there is soul, and there is companionship as your lived spiritual journey unfolds. I want to share one more thing with you this morning, and then I'm going to close. I want to share with you the words of someone we know who loves learning and who has been tested in his life. You've not met him personally, but you are connected to him through this church and through our generosity as a congregation. His name is Nathan, and he's a Unitarian Universalist and a high school student in Kitengela, Kenya. He's one of about 36 students who we helped over the last year to get an education. Nathan says that in his school they take classes in math, English, science, Swahili, and social and religious studies. In science, he writes, they study the human body, health, plants, animal, weather, and solar systems, water, soil, matter, and energy. In social studies, they study Kenya and the world, politics, economics, democracy, and human rights. His favorite classes, he said, are in English and Swahili. He writes, "This is because I want in the future to study law and become a lawyer and then a judge, so that I may have an opportunity to administer justice in this present world where the weak and poor are deprived of their rights in the open daylight." Late last year, he says, a lady was stripped by a mob at a bus stop in Kenya. The reason given by those who did that heinous act is that she dressed indecently. While people should be encouraged to keep good moral values, it is wrong to break the law in violating other people's rights under the guise of trying to bring order to society. Nathan says, contrary to the mathematical formula that a negative plus a negative becomes a positive, two wrongs will never make a right. Many of the perpetrators were reported to have gone scot-free. This led to a number of other women getting stripped in public places for allegedly dressing indecently up to early this year. I have seen little activity being done to end this, but I think if I have the right knowledge as a lawyer, I can do something to that effect. This sounds like a young person who has a good grasp of inherent worth and dignity in a country that's being increasingly dominated by religious conservatives. His hands are ready to give life the shape of justice. Nathan wrote to express his gratitude for our help with his school fees. For many people in this congregation, they seem really modest, just about $400 per student. But they are a huge obstacle for the people of Kitengela because that town is a slum south of Nairobi, and they struggle to get even enough to eat from one day to the next. Nathan says, "I don't know how things would be by now if it weren't for you. Probably I would not have achieved this much in terms of education. Since you started paying our school fees, I've never been sent back home for lack of fees, and therefore no interruptions have been there in my studies. I want one day when I am grown to meet with you and to be able to say thank you in person for all that you are doing." I share this with you this morning because we'll wire the money for this year's school fees this week. A generous donor has already provided $10,000 toward it. Yeah. And if you're able, and you would like also to make a contribution, you can do so too by scanning the QR code on the back of your order of service, or by visiting the social justice table in the social hall, or stopping by the church office anytime between now and Tuesday afternoon. If you choose to go through the QR code, or you can go to the church website also, be sure that you choose other donations and then enter Kenya as the subject for that one so we know how you intended that money. Obviously, with the cost per student being so low, even relatively small donations can really help and make an impact. Since it began, a total of 84 kids in Kitengela have directly benefited from our school tuition fee assistance. 32 completed high school. Of those, 17 got direct admission to public universities in Kenya, which means they passed really well. And the other 15 joined middle-level colleges where they pursue different courses to enable them to find jobs, also to help lift them out of poverty. I just know so many of us see poverty and oppression in the world and we feel helpless and frustrated and sad. And here's a really concrete thing we can do, such a clear way to leverage our resources to empower other people. You can also see photos of the children, and there's a letter from one of the lay leaders in Kitengela on the social justice table. And while you're at it, why not grab a couple of tickets to the social justice auction and the dinner that's happening in a couple of weeks? You can even enter the salsa competition, which is the kind you dip your chips in, not like the dancing kind. So if you're good, you can school the rest of us in how to make salsa. Yeah? Wherever you are in your life this morning, may you find comfort when you need it, and companionship and peace. May you discover what learning there is for you in this moment, whatever it holds. May you be patient with yourselves and others. May you love from a position of strength, and may you be loved in return. Our closing hymn is, help me out. What number is it?